One of my favorite writers, the brilliant Kentucky poet and essayist Wendell Berry, once observed, if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. I have long admired the genius behind being able to deliver that complex concept in 13 words, and the power behind those words. The power behind those words. Geography and identity carry the same amount of DNA. All these tributaries, the country you were born in, the place you were born in, the state you were born in, the city in that state, the part of the city you were born in, the neighborhood, all of these tributaries that flow into creating the narrative river of the self. If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. Nobody understood that concept better than Chief Standing Bear and his 750 Ponca people, a people who had lived along the Niobrara River in the northeast corner of Nebraska, this beautiful homeland, for more than 200 years, transforming the valleys into lush fields of wheat and corn and pumpkins and squash. They knew all the trees, the rocks, the most intricate stone formations, the deepest catfishing holes in the river, and most importantly, the 7 sacred burial sites hidden within the white chalk bluffs overlooking the Missouri River. If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. So imagine the horror, the anger, the outrage, the shock on a cold January day in 1877 when Standing Bear and 750 Ponca people were camped in their winter village along the Niobrara, and a strange white man showed up in their village. From, of all places, the Upper East Side of New York, a white man who knew absolutely nothing about Native Americans specifically and the Ponca in general. And he came to tell them that the Great White Father back east wanted Standing Bear and all of his Ponca people to pack up as soon as they can, bring whatever belongings they could carry, and start walking from their beloved homeland near the South Dakota-Nebraska border to the Indian Territory, more than 550 miles, to a place that would become the state of Oklahoma. Now, we all know, instinctively and otherwise, that no Nebraskan is moving to Oklahoma. Not now, not then, not ever. And that is what Chief Standing Bear and White Eagle conveyed to this strange white man from the East Coast. They were not going anywhere. This was their homeland. For 200 years, not one Senate treaty, but 2 Senate treaties said they were the legal occupiers. How dare you try and kick us off our own land? The government didn't budge. They waited for the winter to calm down, and early spring, they sent a cavalry detachment to the Ponca village, their beloved homeland, and they encircled the village, and shortly after arriving, they cut off all the food, and shortly after that, they cut off all the water, and shortly after that, many of the elders in the tribe and many of the young began to weaken rapidly and were near death. The primary obligation of every chief was the welfare of his people. So Standing Bear and White Eagle and the others had no choice but to begin walking 550 miles from their beloved homeland to a place that would become Oklahoma. It had been an extraordinarily cold, damp, wet spring with some snow in April and early May, so they couldn't leave until May 19th, 1877, when they broke camp Early that morning, it had rained all night, poured all night. It had slowed to a drizzle. The cavalry, with bayonets to their backs, started moving them in the first few steps of a 550-mile journey. It rained all the next day, the 15th and the 16th. And finally, on the 19th, they got to the outskirts of Neely, Nebraska, and they pitched their camp along the Elkhorn River, where it poured all night, and a 2-hour cloudburst the morning of May 23rd opened up. And about the middle of that morning, May 23rd, 1877, a little baby girl, 18 months old, who had been lying on the floor of a cheap, damp Army canvas tent, died of pneumonia. Her mother was so devastated, was so crushed, that she held White Buffalo Girl to her breast, sobbing uncontrollably all morning. When the father came in and tried to gently remove the dead child from her arms, she pushed him away and just kept crying and kept crying. And finally, the father went to the head of the cavalry unit and begged him to go into the community of Neely and to see if they could find the town carpenter and to see if he could build a tiny wooden casket and a tiny wooden cross, and if they could have permission to bury White Buffalo Girl in the Neely Cemetery before their orders were to break camp and continue to march out the next day. So they went into the village. They found the carpenter. He built a tiny wooden coffin. He built a tiny wooden cross. And the next afternoon, on the highest hill of the Laurel Hill Cemetery, virtually the entire community of Neely came out in a steady drizzle to bury White Buffalo Girl. And after she was buried, Black Elk, through an interpreter, begged the community of Neely to care for his dead baby daughter as though she were one of their own. A promise that the village of Neely has kept for 147 years. I first went to this grave about 10 years ago when I was doing research up on the Niobrara River. I was driving back to Lincoln, and I just decided I had to see this grave. It was late at night, about 10:30, quarter to 11, mid-September, beautiful fall evening. And I knew exactly where to go in this cemetery that swept over 3 hills high above the Elkhorn River that contained more than 2,000 graves, because the president of the Antelope County Historical Society had given me specific instructions where White Buffalo Girl's grave was. So I pulled in about 10:30, quarter to 11, beautiful autumn evening, completely dark, except for a full moon that was lighting the way. It was an easy grave to follow. I parked the car just inside the gates, turned right, kept walking, and there I saw it. The headstone over 125 years old, and this grave bathed in just this sweeping carpet of moonlight, and covering the entire grave were all of these little teddy bears and colored bunnies and little ducks and chickens and blankets and flowers and quarters and tobacco and sage, spiritual and holy elements left by the native people who came to visit the grave. And I just stood there, all alone in the dark, in the moonlight, looking at this grave and reimagining what this mother felt, what these people felt, this whole story, and the promise that this village had made and had kept. And it brought me to tears standing there that night. And people still come to this gravesite all the time. On Mother's Day, mothers from around the Neely area bring their young daughters to the grave of White Buffalo Girl, and they tell them the story. The story of a community that used its open hearts and kindness to overcome death and despair. A story that can still happen right now, right here, anywhere, if we'll only let it.